Hello, welcome back to Classical Conditioning. So this is our second video for the Classical Conditioning PowerPoint, and we're moving on to actually talk about classical conditioning. So very quickly, we did this in our Zoom lesson today. We had a quick look at conditioning as a term in general, and we talked about the fact that basically conditioning and learning can be used interchangeably. They kind of mean the same thing. Technically, conditioning is it's how we learn, but you can say learning instead of conditioning and conditioning instead of learning, and it's generally fine. My advice would be to, as always, take your guidance from the way that your question is phrased. If you're getting a question about conditioning, you should be saying conditioning in your response, not randomly just talking about it in general as learning. Likewise, if you're getting a question about learning that doesn't really clearly indicate that you're meant to move towards conditioning in your response, then you can get away with saying learning. For me, as a safety measure, probably I would try to use conditioning more, because that's probably what you're going to use most in your responses. So we also talked about the fact that we're going to look at 3 different types of learning in Chapter 5. 2 of them are conditioning, so we have classical conditioning, which we're working on at the moment, and operant conditioning. And the last type of learning that we're going to look at is observational learning, and we'll get to that along the way. If in any of the practice questions that you do, particularly if you're looking at older ones, if you come across things like insight learning or latent learning, just ignore it, because they don't exist in the study design anymore. So you can just put those questions aside and go on to something else. All right, so because we looked at some of this in our Zoom session, I'm going to skip through the big questions and the advertising logos, the finishing the sentences, and we're going to start with the slide titled Classical Conditioning. And classical conditioning is what we call a simple form of learning. The other ones we're going to look at throughout the chapter are more complex. It's simple because it is dealing with reflexive behaviour, which is what we call simple behaviour, because there is no voluntary or conscious input from the brain in a reflex, because generally, if we looked at it from a biological level, a reflex only involves maybe 1 or 2 synapses. It is considered simple behaviour. Therefore, classical conditioning using reflexes is a simple form of learning. And in essence, classical conditioning is about associating 2 things, and we talked about that a bit already with the advertising. So we're going to use the word association a lot when we talk about classical conditioning. I'll warn you now, you're going to say association so many times it stops feeling like a real word. But classical conditioning occurs through the repeated association of 2 or more different stimuli. And again, remembering what we talked about in the last video, how we're defining learning for psychology, we need to have something measurable in order to say that learning has occurred. So in classical conditioning, we say that the learning has occurred when a stimulus that initially didn't produce a response now produces a response, and repeatedly does so. The way it works, and again, we talked about this in class today, is that we, through repeated association, eventually link 2 or more stimuli so strongly in our brains that one stands in for the other, and then leads to the response. So let's break that down into some terminology. Before we do that, let's have a quick discussion about the man that brought us classical conditioning, Ivan Pavlov, who is this very hirsute gentleman here. Excellent facial hair going on. Actually, weirdly, a lot of the psychologists we talk about in learning have some serious facial hair going on. I'm not sure why. That's the trend, but that is Ivan Pavlov. And of course, he is most famous for his Pavlov's dogs experiment. So Pavlov initially actually wasn't interested in learning at all. That wasn't his field of research. What he was doing was investigating digestion. And so he was studying the digestive systems of dogs. Now, if you have dogs or have been around dogs a fair bit, you'll know that they drool a lot when there's food. These lovely darlings drool a lot when there's food. So that is a reflexive behavior for them. That is a reflex action. Pretty much every dog is going to do that. You present them with food and they are just going to start drooling. What Pavlov started to notice though was that the dogs were starting to drool even when they hadn't been yet presented with food. And so he started to pay attention to their behavior, and he noticed that they were starting to drool as soon as one of the lab technicians would walk into their area. The dogs had basically made a connection in their brain between lab technician, usually someone in a white lab coat, and getting fed, because what would happen is the lab technician would come in to do the research. As part of the research, they would give the dog food, and then they would collect the drool, see how much was produced, all that sort of stuff. So there was this repeated association over time. Person walks in, presents with food, dog drools. And eventually that linking of person walking in and the dog getting fed became so strong that in the dog's brain, they stood in for each other. So the response that they would normally have to food, which was drooling, they started to have to the other stimulus, the person walking into the room. That really was the essence of Pavlov's study. But he then went, okay, can I recreate this? Is it just going to happen to people that, like, are they only going to drool to the person feeding them, or can I replace the person with anything else? And so he came up with a study, if we move to the next slide, where he would ring a bell whenever the dog was being fed. And he did this repeatedly over time to create that association, and that repetition is an important part of classical conditioning. Generally, when we're talking about classical conditioning, we're talking about repeated association. There are instances where it's not repeated, and that will come up a little bit later on, and you'll probably get annoyed and go, oh, it's so confusing. But for the moment, let's just talk about repeated associations and do one thing at a time. So whenever the dogs were fed, there was a bell rung. And the dogs eventually put those two things together in their brain, and they stood in for each other. So food equaled bell, bell equaled food, and therefore the drooling response happened to both of them. And it got to the point eventually where Pavlov was able to ring the bell without having any food in the room, and the dogs would drool. Their brain had learned to have that reflexive behaviour in response to a new stimuli, and therefore classical conditioning had taken place. Now, at the bottom of this slide, there is a link to a clip, Classical Conditioning, the Basics. I'm not going to show that to you now. That's something for you to have a look at in your own time if you're interested. It basically walks you through Pavlov's experiment a little bit more slowly with some little cute little animations, but I'll leave that one if you're interested. And I will instead move on. So on our next slide, we have a meme because it's been a little while and it was probably time for a meme. And this one is one of my favorites, but that's just because I'm a lame psychology teacher. This is very much psychology humor. So it's one dog saying to another, watch what I can make Pavlov do. As soon as I drool, he'll smile and write in his little book. So it's this idea of Pavlov thinks he's conditioning the dog to drool, and the dog is actually conditioning Pavlov to write in his book. Hilarious psychology humor. But more interesting, the link at the bottom of this slide is to a little interactive game that you can play online where you can have a go at conditioning a dog. So if you click on the link, it'll take you to a little Flash animation game. You do need to have a Flash player installed in order for you to be able to play it, unless they've updated it, but I'm pretty sure from memory you needed Flash player. And it may need different browsers. Sometimes people have trouble playing it on Google Chrome. So you might have to do it in Safari or something like that. Have a go, see how you go with it. But basically you have a little animated dog and you have a bell and some drums and something else, I think, and some food, and you have to pair things correctly in the right order and the right timing to try and condition the dog to drool. So that's something you can have a go at yourself. I recommend maybe waiting until you've watched a little bit more about classical conditioning and you've learned about the correct timing and order of presentation so that you can do it properly. But of course you could always just go in and play around and accidentally get it right as well. All right, let's move on. So talking about Pavlov's dogs, we are now going to get into the terminology that we need to know. We have 5 terms that we really need to know. Only 4 of them are listed on this slide. The 5th one we'll get to in another slide. So we have the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response. And the really nice thing about classical conditioning, and actually most of the learning topic, is that the terminology is really obvious and self-explanatory. So knowing, as we already do, that conditioning can mean the same thing as learning. If something is conditioned, then it has been learned. If it is unconditioned, then it hasn't been learned and therefore is reflexive. Stimulus means something in the environment that can trigger a response, and response obviously is the behaviour that occurs. So if we break that down, our unconditioned stimulus is something in the environment that is going to trigger a response that has not been learned, that is reflexive. That reflexive response is an unconditioned response, an unlearned one. A conditioned stimulus is something in the environment that we have learned to respond to, that before conditioning occurred, we wouldn't have responded to in that way, but now we have learned a particular response to it. And that particular response is our conditioned response, our learned response. So really straightforward and logical. So if we put that model against Pavlov's experiment, the unconditioned stimulus is the food, because the food is something that exists in the environment that the dogs automatically respond to without having to ever have been taught to respond in that way. So the unconditioned response is the salivation, the drooling, and that is occurring in response to the food. And that whole relationship of food and drooling is unconditioned. They were never taught to do that. The conditioned stimulus, the thing that we want to teach the new response to, or that we have taught a new response to, is the bell. And the note there is it starts off as the neutral stimulus, and that's our 5th term that we need to know. So I lied when I said it wasn't on this slide. I just wasn't paying attention. It is on the slide because I was accidentally awesome. So our 5th term, neutral stimulus, neutral meaning doesn't produce any relevant response. And that, as a side note, is the way I would like you to phrase it when you are talking about a neutral stimulus. The best way you can phrase it is to say, produces no relevant response. You'll see it written a few other ways. You'll say produces an irrelevant response or does not produce a specific behaviour. I really like, just can't remember what I said now, produces no relevant response. But as long as you've got the same meaning, you're fine. I just really like that particular phrasing. So neutral stimulus, it's something that in the environment is not producing a relevant response. It doesn't mean it doesn't produce any response, so don't say that. It's an irrelevant or a not relevant response in this scenario. So a bell is going to produce some sort of response for those dogs. They're going to hear it, they might turn towards it, they might shrink away from it if the sound was really loud and they were scared of it. They're all responses. They're just not relevant to what we're interested in, which in this case is salivation. So the bell is our neutral stimulus, and once we have taught the dogs to respond to it, it becomes what we call the conditioned stimulus, because now it has had something learned, so therefore conditioned. And the salivation that was initially an unconditioned response, because it's now happening to the bell, not the food, we call it a conditioned response. Hopefully that makes sense. I do find with classical conditioning, you either kind of get it straight away or you kind of stare at it and it's gibberish for a little bit, but you just need to keep practicing mapping it out. So doing practice questions where you get a scenario, breaking it down into what's the unconditioned stimulus, what's the unconditioned response, blah, 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 and that kind of helps you understand. So if right now you're feeling a bit overwhelmed or it's just not making sense, bear with it. Go and watch the little Pavlov video that talks you through it. It will make sense. It just sometimes takes you a little bit longer. Okay, next slide. So on this slide, we've got a diagram that breaks all of those terms down into our 3 phases. Remember we talked at the start in the first video when we were looking at the key knowledge that for classical conditioning, we want to talk about it in a 3-phase model. So those are our 3 phases. Phase 1 is before conditioning, phase 2 is during, and phase 3 is after. So before conditioning, before we've done anything, before we've made any associations, just this is how it was existing in day-to-day life, the bell was the neutral stimulus, which did not lead to a relevant response. And the food was an unconditioned stimulus, which led to salivation. Then in phase 2, during conditioning, is when we're actively trying to teach the new behaviour. And in the during conditioning phase, we are pairing the neutral stimulus, the bell, with the unconditioned stimulus of the food. And that combined stimulation leads us to the unconditioned response of salivation. Now, it's important to note the salivation is still unconditioned here because we still have food in the picture. As long as there is food there, which is an unconditioned stimulus, we're going to get an unconditioned response. It isn't until we move until after conditioning that we can use the terms conditioned stimulus and conditioned response. The after conditioning phase is the only place that you should be saying conditioned stimulus and conditioned response, because that is the only stage where we are saying learning has actually occurred. So in the after conditioning phase, the neutral stimulus of the bell has now become the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response is salivation. When you are talking about the response, you'll note it's the same behaviour. Yeah, because that's the whole point of classical conditioning. We want to take a behaviour that's happening in response to one thing and teach it to respond to something else. What I want you to get into the habit of is writing responses where you actually phrase it to make it clear that you understand the difference between unconditioned and conditioned. So what a lot of students do is they go through and they go, the unconditioned stimulus of the food led to the unconditioned response of salivation, and then the bell led to salivation after conditioning. Great, yes, but make it super, super clear that in before conditioning, the salivation, the unconditioned salivation, is in response to the food, whereas in after conditioning, the salivation is in response to the bell. There's lots of different ways you can phrase it to achieve that, but you just need to make sure that in your responses, you are making it clear you understand which salivation is which, I guess. Which one is happening to the food versus which one is happening to the bell, because that shows the full extent of your understanding then. All right, next slide. Factors that influence classical conditioning. So there are a number of things that we need to know about the way classical conditioning works, and these are the things that are going to help you succeed in that little animated game. So firstly, the nature of the response. The unconditioned response, so in Pavlov's case, the dog's salivating to the food, it has to be reflexive. For classical conditioning to work, the behaviour that we're working with has to be reflexive. And basically what we're doing is we're taking a reflex and transferring it across to a different stimulus. The second point, association of stimuli. There has to be a link between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. We have to be pairing those things so closely in our brain that they stand in for each other. And there's a point there about contiguity. That's just a really fancy word that you could use if you wanted to. It's the formation of a connection or association between two events when the events occur close together in time and or space. If you feel strongly about using the word contiguity, go nuts. If you don't, totally okay. And then the really, really important one, frequency and timing of stimulus presentation. For classical conditioning to work, we need to be presenting the neutral stimulus first and then the unconditioned stimulus. Excuse me. Yes, I'm done. Hang on. I lied. Now I'm done. It's not coronavirus. I'm just not used to talking this much. So the neutral stimulus has to be presented first, then the unconditioned stimulus. And they should be separated by no more than about half a second. They should be really, really close together, because the timing of having them really close together enables our brain to link them. The order, if you think about it logically, excuse me while I just grab a drink. If you think about it logically, if you presented the food to the dogs first, they're going to start salivating straight away. So as far as their brain is concerned, the process of stimulus and then response has already happened. If you then, once they've already done that, ring the bell, there's no reason for their brain to connect the bell to what has already happened in terms of a response. So the bell just becomes this random extra thing that's happening in their life, but it's got nothing to do with their salivation. If you do it in the correct order, bell, then food, what happens is that the brain is able to connect those ideas all together. So the dog's brain goes, I hear a bell, then I get food, and therefore I salivate. And if you keep doing that over time, it's basically dropping that middle step because the bell and the food sort of merge into one. So bell takes us straight to salivation without the need for food in the middle. Hopefully that makes sense to you. So when you're having a go at that online game, think about which order you need to do things in, presenting the bell and then the food, and how quickly you need to do it. Okay. Next step, some helpful rules or tricks for doing classical conditioning. And I might actually do a little explainer video just on this as well because it's a handy way to do it. So there are some things that you can keep in the back of your mind to help you figure out the different steps in classical conditioning, which bit goes where and how it all goes together. Rule number 1, the neutral stimulus always becomes the conditioned stimulus. If you're given a scenario and you can figure out which thing was neutral to begin with, what initially did not cause a response, automatically you've also figured out what the conditioned stimulus is going to be. Likewise, don't be afraid to work backwards because some scenarios can be a little bit confusing and you actually need to start from the very end and go, what's the outcome? What was the response we ended up with? Okay, and then work backwards from there. So if you are struggling to figure out what the neutral stimulus is, figure out what stimulus they've learned to respond to. That's your conditioned stimulus, and therefore automatically that is also your neutral stimulus. Rule number 2, the unconditioned response becomes the conditioned response. We already talked about that a bit. So the response, the behaviour is the same. It's changing what it is in response to, but because it's a simple reflexive behaviour, the behaviour itself does not change. Salivation is salivation. All that's changing is whether it's in response to the food or the bell. So again, when you're trying to break it down into its components, so if you get a scenario, what is the behaviour? What is the outcome that we're looking at here? That is your unconditioned and your conditioned response. Rule number 3, your unconditioned stimulus is something that causes a reflexive response. So if you're struggling to figure out the neutral and conditioned stimulus, the other way you could do it is figure out which one the unconditioned stimulus is, and therefore, by default, once you've got that, then whatever's left over is your conditioned stimulus. So the unconditioned stimulus has to cause a reflexive response. It has to be something that your organism is responding to without thinking about it. And rule number 4, as I've already said, always, 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 always use our 3-phase model. Be very clear in each stage what's happening. It is not enough to just 2 dot points. It is not enough to just go NS, arrow, CS, or that's actually completely wrong, but you get what I mean. Even though that's how you'll often see it in the textbooks is with those little diagrams, you are expected in the exam to do it in sentence form and paragraph form. So my recommendation, use subheadings. I would do before conditioning as a subheading, write a little paragraph with a couple of sentences, during conditioning and after conditioning. If you don't want to do subheadings, if you're feeling a bit more confident about putting it all together, really your subheading just becomes an opening sentence. In the before conditioning stage or before conditioning, the neutral stimulus was blah, blah, blah. But it's super, super important that you're using those 3 stages and that you are not just doing dot points. What you can do Having said that, is use the abbreviations. It is absolutely acceptable to go straight into doing NS, CS, UCS, UCR without writing them out in full first because they are so commonly used. Just make sure you get them right. If you swap some letters around, or if you accidentally put UCS instead of CS or vice versa, you're in all sorts of trouble. So make sure that you are practicing it. My personal advice, when you're doing any classical conditioning response, in the little margin next to your writing space, dot point it out. NS is this, CS is this, blah, blah, blah. And that way, you know that you've got the right information when you're writing out your response. Because sometimes when we're writing in paragraph form, we get a little bit confused halfway through. If you've got that little dot point next to you, then you're good to go.